And we are back for another episode of Enneagram Restored Podcast. In fact, it is one of the final few episodes of this season. I am your 5'4" black, sexy milk chocolate man of a host, Braylon Williams, a friend of the Here's the Thing podcast. Just welcome to this episode of the podcast. If you're a returning listener, a returning watcher, I want to say thank you for coming back. But if you're new to this, I want to give you a double thanks for finding this podcast and tuning in to this episode. This is a podcast that I do where I just talk about the Enneagram and how I believe it is like the best tool to help us make, as I always say, take the good in us and make it best, and take the bad in us and make it good. It is a roadmap. It is not the final destination, but it is a roadmap that you can use to get to your destination. And hopefully that destination is the best version of yourself. But one of the things I always like to do at the very outset of each episode is just talk about some things that's happening recently for me. As I'm recording this, the day yesterday, I've lived in Springfield for 6 years now, but yesterday I just finally went to a Missouri State football game and tailgate event. So that was a new experience. It was fun, new experience. But as I was there, I was just thinking about how the stark difference of my life in accordance to athletic events. Of course, in high school, I was in marching band, which meant I was pretty much at school all day on Fridays because the games were Friday nights, and preparing for that, and then practicing during band class, but also warming up and kind of put some additional finishing touches on before the football game that night. And then Saturdays were competitions, and then in college for a couple of years I did marching band as well. And so then really again repeating that force of being in band and being there at the games, because I was in the band, so I had to be there. But yesterday was the second football game that I've been to since I've no longer been doing marching band. So it was one of those, I really felt a feeling of nostalgia yesterday, because watching the band perform, and it's like I miss those times. Don't miss the uniforms, because the uniforms were like, and this is coming from a person who likes to be hot during the day and cold at night, but the uniforms were hot. And when I refer back to my junior year of high school, when I was the smallest person carrying the biggest bass drum, I always say every competition, every rehearsal where we wore the uniforms, which was rare, but every performance where we had on our uniforms, I was always dripping so much sweat that I could have swam in it. I know that's a disgusting image to give, but that's the imagery that comes along with it for me. But yeah, and so it just kind of felt a little sense of nostalgia yesterday, seeing band performance. I missed that. And I as a substitute teacher, I kind of branded myself as the music substitute teacher. So I go and I sub for music classes a lot. So I still get the sense of being in a band sometimes when I'm subbing for the band directors in the school district. But it's not the same as being in it and performing. And it's just, I miss it. I know this is, familiarity is the first word that comes to mind, but that's not really the word that I'm looking for that comes with that. And so it was just one of those nice things. But time moves forward, life goes on, and we find new things. But in other news, one of the things I've also have done recently is that I've just released my Enneagram Resources Guide. Now, this is a guide that is designed with links to books, podcasts, websites, recommended Enneagram coaches, and even more to help you learn about the Enneagram. And the nice thing about this, and what I like the most about this guide, is that there's something for everyone. If you're completely new to the Enneagram, there's a resource for you. If you've been studying the Enneagram for a few months to years, there is something for you. If if you consider yourself almost on the spectrum of being of kind of like pro Enneagram knowledge, there's still something for you. Uh, there is a link in this resource that is for everybody. And this is just the first of many resources that I'm going to put out. Excuse me, I just ate lunch and so now I'm burping a lot. Or is I? Oh, this is just the first of many Enneagram resources that I will be putting out. This one is very basic, but in the future, I hope to get one where it's really like sectioned out for like where you might be in your Enneagram journey, whether you're a beginner or you're like a couple months in, really sectioning out those resources for you. But this resource is free. So all you gotta do is go to my website, which is braylonwilliams.me/Enneagram guide to download it. And I'm gonna put that link in the show notes. So you just click that, it'll take you right there. And it's a free download. All you gotta do is put in your name and email and it is yours. You will receive it in your email pretty much instantaneously. So it's free, it's jam-packed with a lot of resources, and even this one I hope to go back and add some resources. So but yeah, go ahead. Head to braylonwilliams.me/Enneagram guide to download it now. It's free and it's very resourceful. Like I said, again, the link will be in the show notes. But anyway, moving on to what today's show is about. Today is a breather, really. Kind of taking a step to that. We came. I'm thinking because I was teaching second grade class, and during ELA, the teacher's been going over like plot and of stories. So the podcast has come. We went up the mountain. We hit our climax, and now we're on our slow descent down to the resolution. And so this is pretty much today's episode. We're starting that descent to our resolution, and so. One of the things I am going to be talking about in today's episode is my journey of going from a type 8 to a type 3. But before I go there, I want to give you a little update about what is happening about and what is the future of this podcast going to look like. So very briefly, I want to start off by talking about some quick stats, some quick statistics that have really pulled through from this podcast in this season. And then I'm also going to talk about on the rest of this season as well, because there's been a shift in season 4 of where that is going. But then we're going to look past season 4 and in possible season 5, season 6, and so forth. But the first stat that I am like over the moon about is that across Spotify and Apple Podcasts, this show has gotten a great number of plays, all equally. This happened to me on Friday. I got tongue-tied easily. Plays equaling 4,000 plays. On the downside of that is that across these platforms, this is a stat that I was hoping would have increased this season, but it did not. Follower count has remained at 17, which has been like that count for the past couple seasons. So I was hoping that would have increased, but that did not. But that's okay. Still got a great amount of plays, which is good. And the most played episode across Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts has been my episode that I recorded with Mike Brown, Liminal. So if you haven't seen it, go back, because apparently it's the most famous one. So I did have fun filming that one too. So it's because I meet with so many great people and we have so many great conversations. It's really tough to pick favorites of conversations. But if I had to pick a couple favorites, that that conversation with Mike Brown definitely would have been one of the top favorites. And as you know, posting every episode, whether it was a solo or a guest episode this season, is something that I started doing new this time. In previous seasons, if it was a guest episode, that's the only time an episode got posted to YouTube. If it was just me, as you're seeing now on the screen, it was just an audio only version available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all those places. But this season, I decided, hey, whether it's just me or whether I'm talking with the guest, the video is going to be put on YouTube. So, and with that being said, I was kind of blown away. My expectations for the statistics on what would happen for YouTube video views and YouTube stats altogether were very nominal. They were very little. But I would have to say that looking at the stats and going back, and now all these stats are a couple days old because I did not go and refresh numbers, but they won't be too far off. But looking at these stats a couple days ago, I was surprised because, like I said, my expectation of stats were here, but here's what the results were. So it was one of those nice things, like you expected little, but you got more than you expected. And so, but on YouTube alone, this podcast has gotten 98 views and 2.4 thousand impressions. Now, impressions, to clarify the difference between views and impressions. So 98 views are people who actually clicked into the content and watched a little bit of it, watched some of it, whereas impressions, those are the amount of people who may have saw the thumbnail pop up in somewhere on their YouTube feed, but they didn't necessarily click into the video, which seems like that's not a great stat to look at, but it's actually a great it's actually something, even though it's a very, like, people didn't see it didn't really see the content, they just saw like the preview of the content type of thing. That's something you want to watch out for, because that's saying, hey, more people are engaging, so YouTube's algorithm is trying to push it to more people. So typically the higher impressions, the more views you get. And I'm no statistician on this content type of things, but honestly, 98 views with 2.4 thousand impressions, and what I produce content wise, that's been a great like benchmark. It's like per kind of like 2,000 impressions, you have almost 100 views. So, but also on YouTube, further stats go to say that there have been a total of 64 viewers, with 55 of those being first-time viewers and 9 of those being people who keep coming back to the content, keep saying, hey, oh, there's a new video posted, let me go see what's happening in this video. So great numbers. As far as like viewers, unique viewers coming back into the fold. I will admit though, the returning views are a little bit lower than I expected. I was expecting in double digits at least, the teens, no more than 35 returning viewers was my expectation for this season. So didn't quite reach that goal on YouTube, but new viewers, was about 10 to 15 viewers over what I had expected for YouTube this season. So just overall view count, unique viewers, and all of the YouTube stats, like I said, were overall were past my expectations. So I'm happy about that. But now let me tell you about the future of this podcast, because things are changing. Things had a great season. and the season's not quite over yet. Still got a couple more episodes, but there's some change happening. Uh, so, but let me step back to get you to where I want to go. Coming into this season of the podcast, I told myself that this was going to be the season that determined the future of the show, because previous seasons have been primarily solo episodes and have garnered very low stats. My hope was that by having a season that was jam packed with guests, that would change like the stats of the show, and it did, but it did not change the stats significantly enough for me to want to continue producing the show in the current way that I am. And what does that mean? Currently, that means this podcast is released on a weekly basis, and the amount of prep that goes into one episode is anywhere from 2.5 weeks to 2 months in just prep before I even record an episode, and then editing and getting things ready for social media posts and publishing. That's about another week and a half to 2.5 weeks, typically. So there's a lot of time in the production of this. And the stats just were not. They didn't increase as much as I was hoping overall across Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. They did not increase enough for me to want to continue producing the show in this manner. And so, since I am just not seeing the stats that I was hoping to see, and since like my overall life schedule, work included, has changed, and is becoming harder and harder to produce this podcast, this show, specifically, on a weekly basis, the way that is doing. And since this show isn't really, and here's the biggest kicker part of it, I would probably be more apt to continuing on this weekly basis if this show was bringing in revenue, but it just is not bringing in any revenue. And I've tried different streams. I've tried saying, hey, give what you can. I've tried merch. I've tried, anything that I know I can do, but it is not. This show is not bringing in any revenue, and so with all that in mind, one, I decided to cut this fourth season short. So what that means is that I originally planned on recording 20 episodes for this season 4. But I decided to cut it short by 5 episodes. So episode 15 will be the season finale, which is just 2 episodes away. So don't miss that, because it's really going to put the cherry on top of the entire topic that we've been discussing. We've been looking at this entire podcast. But then going further into the future, what does that mean for the podcast? And this is where I'm a little bit of hard pressed, because, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, but in the end, I've come to this understanding that I'm not really ready to completely quit this show yet. My hope, my goal is to at least get 2 more seasons out of any Grammar Store podcast before I say, hey, is this a show that continues past 6 seasons, a type of thing. But here's the thing, like I said, the amount of work that goes into producing this podcast is a lot of work, and the amount of revenue that this show brings in is currently 0. And plus the stats not improving significantly enough. It honestly just isn't making any more sense to carve out the amount of time that it takes to produce this show the way that it is currently produced. uh, anymore. Uh, of course, when I started this, a weekly podcast, I was in college. So extra time was something I had. But now, um, Mondays through Monday through Thursdays, I'm working at least 12 hours a day between substitute teaching and then Spark as well. So you can see there that time is very limited for me. And so to produce a podcast that is not improving statistically enough and is not bringing in zero any revenue, just isn't worth it anymore. So, but since I'm not ready to call it quits, I decided that what I am going to do is first I'm going to take a break from just even thinking about podcasting altogether for a couple months. Once the season finale is out, which will be in about 2 weeks from this episode, 2 weeks from this episode dropping. So I'll take a couple months off, and then I'm after a little sabbatical from podcasting. I'm going to take some time to reevaluate the strategy of podcast production for my brand, because, like I said, I want to continue podcasting altogether, and I would love to continue to podcast about the Enneagram. But I've also thought about doing a podcast about interior design, specifically as I'm building my interior design business, and kind of like life lessons and things that have happened kind of through the formation of that. And so I'm going to take some time off them. Then I'm going to take some time to reevaluate the podcast production strategy altogether for my brand. And we'll go from there. We'll see if this show comes back. First, but then if it does come back, I can say this, that if I do come back for season 5 or season 6, I can guarantee you that it most likely will not be in a weekly format. Right now, the largest release format that I'm thinking for this podcast is to be either released once a month or released twice a month. So you get a new episode. So right now it's either one new episode a month or either 2 new episodes a month. That's just going to cut down on production time altogether. So it's a lot. Like I said, there's a lot to think about as far as like production, but then also as far as what type of podcast do I want to produce. And so I just gotta step back and take a look back for the brand altogether. Hey everybody, I just want to take a quick break from the show to say that I love having conversations with all of my listeners. And one of the ways that I do this is by engaging through social media. And you can follow the podcast at Enneagram Store Podcast on both Instagram and Facebook. I look forward to engaging with you all more on those platforms. But with all that being said and that being down, now let me tell you about. I'm gonna sit back and I'm gonna relax a little bit because at this point I'm going off script. Like literally in my notes, I just said, "Hey, the journey of rediscovering my type," because there's a lot to talk about here, and I'm gonna try to give you the full fleshed out story, but also try to keep it short and sweet. So, when I first discovered the Enneagram, I was a freshman in college at Evangel University. At that time, I did not have any fondness over the Enneagram because of the way people talked about it. It was talked in this manner of, hey, here's this box and this is what you got to live in. If you do something, you have to say, hey, you just got to get over it because this is my type. But to me, even just from the outset of discovering this typing indicator, it just did not feel right that it was this defining tool. Even then, I just kind of felt like this tool was meant to be used as something different, something more. Um, so it took me some time to want to kind of even get into it. I mean, in fact, the only reason I did start, and I even did take a test over the Enneagram was because I got into so many circles to where like the topic of conversation always somehow, even if it was just for a brief moment, turned to saying, "Hey, this is my Enneagram type," and I just sat there not wanting to, but not being able to contribute to that part of discussion because I knew nothing about my type. I was very much against the Enneagram. Um, but I finally broke down and said, hey, I guess I can at least take a test to figure out my type. So that way I can at least say in conversation, hey, this is my type. And I contributed a little is to the conversation. Little did I know, though, at that time, that was like the catalyst, the linchpin in all of it. And it just kind of domino effect from there. And here I am today, one of the most avid Enneagram people that I know personally, but also like one of the people trying to incorporate the Enneagram in so much things, um, because I believe in its um, value. Um, but yeah, but that test I took, it said my most type, my, of course, here's the thing about the Enneagram, I've said this in previous seasons, um, we actually embellish all the nine types, but our primary type is the type that we are like the most. That's because that's from our childhood of where we've heard these messages again. And so it told me that I'm an eight, the challenger. And I read through it. I'm like, I really like the eight. That sounds like me. Somebody who's always kind of been for social justice. The eight was that person. I was like, I can live this. So I lived it. I started looking into life as an eight, what that means. The line movement, stress, security, and all that. Um, but then there was, fast forward a couple months to a year and a half or so, I'm in this counseling session at Evangel, and I was telling my counselor um, about my aspirations of wanting to be famous, my aspiration of wanting to be president of the United States. And she was like, "Are you sure you're an eight? That sounds very three-ish to me." At the time, I just pushed it back. I didn't have time to even consider maybe she's right, because my schedule was like boom, boom, boom. There's always something that me trying to work in a moment of rest was a challenge at that time. I mean, so it was just a thought that I pushed back to the back of my mind, but it was still there because I remember every now and then it would come to the forefront. I'm like, maybe she's right. Uh, maybe she's right. And I'm trying to think. Gosh, I want to say, I was going to say, hey, if you're having to listen to this, thank you to her, but I can't remember her name. I want to say her name was Lizzie. Again, that was years ago. As I tell my students that I sub for all the time, Mr. B is horrible with names, but I will remember your face till the day I die. But I think her name was Lizzie. Um, yeah. I'll be trying to think about that all day. But anyway, so she suggested that. I pushed it back to the very back of my mind and never really kind of even to try to actually think about it until this past year, where I like to say I was kind of forced into this liminal space where like nothing is happening. The most I do is go to work and come home, and that's it. But at the start of this space where like all I do is go home, go to work, come home, and I just didn't feel at home in my body. Something felt wrong. Um, Not only was I kind of like experienced a lot of physical sickness recurrently often, which is still haven't figured out what is happening there. Um, but I also just didn't feel mentally right. Uh, I started doing things that I never would do. Um, Previous years, if I was stressed, I could still work through my stuff and get and be efficient and get stuff done. But recently, this past year and a half, even the slightest bit of stress sent me to a point where like I just want to lay down and forget about everything. I don't even want to try to work out what is happening here. And I'm like, this just does not feel like me. So I just me not feeling at home in my body, and then here's the key that really kicked me into saying, hey, maybe I should really look into this idea that I might be a three. It's because I knew threes and stress go to nine, and thing about a nine is they're very slothful. They're especially in their low levels of health. A nine is very like, hey, I'm just gonna lay on the couch, watch TV, not get anything done type of behavior. So that's what really keyed me in to be like, it is worth that. I need to actually take out time and be intentional about figuring out, am I a three or am I an eight? And so I go through all my different resources. I have tons of books. I forget the account now. I think it's about 17 different Enneagram books that I have now, but I have about 20 more on my Amazon shopping list. So yeah, I go through all my resources, the websites I know, some of which that are in that guide that I was telling you about earlier, which you can also get that guide for free again by going to my website, which is in the show notes, which is braylonwilliams.ma/Enneagram guide. This is just another short plug, but that link is in the show notes. You get that guide, which has some of these books that help me figure this out in it. I just start looking at it, and I'm like, so the very first thing that I did was like, all right, let's just start back at the basics. So I looked at, I got my book, uh, what is it called? Can't think of it. Suzanne Stabile and Ian Morgan Crone co-authored it. The Path Between Us. I got that book, and I just went and I started to go back and look at all the different childhood messages, and everything. I'm like, all right, I know this one's the eight, is that vulnerability is not okay. But then I went back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, even 7, and even reread the 8 and 9. And I was like, all right, which ones of these speak the most? It was 3, 8. I want to say that another one that really spoke the most to me was, I think it was 4. And so I narrowed down to those 3, and then from there I'm like, all right, 4 just isn't quite there for me. But then there's the clue to maybe maybe I'm a 3 wing 4. So I'm going through all this, thinking all these different things. There's a long thought process behind, am I a 3 or am I an 8? Even when it comes to emotions, because 8s and 3s share that in common. But then there's also this thinking, because social 3s can look a lot like 8s. And so I thought about that. Maybe I'm a social, which wasn't really even maybe, because I knew even when I said I was an 8, social was my, like, has always been my top instinctual variant. It's always been like social, and then self-present and sexual have always kind of flip-flopped every now and then. But social has always been the one that has remained constant when it comes to the instinctual variance for me. And so I was like, I know social 3s can look a lot like 8s, so maybe that's the confusion. But then I even start to look back some more, and I start looking back at some memories from childhood and school, and everything. And I'm looking back and I'm like, why? And even now, like from college, thinking back to why I did some things in college, why I joined the worship team at James River, why I wanted to pursue the degree that I was pursuing, and it all started making sense. That, of course, some of these things are things that I love to do, but like 99% of the reason why I wanted to do these things is because I got attention from them. And once I figured that out, I was like, yeah, pretty sure I'm a three. But even still, I was not like, I was like, all right, I'm pretty settled in this fact that I mistyped myself and I'm actually a three. And I've been saying I was an eight. But it's still, I want to be sure of myself. Uh, I remember I was talking to, there was somebody else I was talking to, I can't remember. But um, I think it was with Tyler Zach. I was I was talking when we recorded the episode. I was talking with him about this idea that I think I was still in the thick of it, trying to figure out. I think it was, if I remember right. But then I also I had a Zoom conversation with Christy Erickson. She's an Enneagram coach, and she pretty much was validating everything that I figured out. It was like, yeah, you are a three, which she recommended that I watch Inside Out. I was like, I remember telling her that I'm a big Disney fan. Pixar has a lot of great movies, but me and I just don't see the value in that movie. But she convinced me, and I did. And I'm like, I wish I would have watched this movie from the get go. Still haven't seen Inside Out 2, but I need to see it. But yeah, so there's this whole journey, and like I said, that's a very that synopsis is very quick, very brief overview of it. But there's a lot of thought process that went into that. There's a lot of reflection, a lot of different questioning, lines of question I not only even asked myself, but I was like, as I was listening to other people who I know are threes, or even like listen to like podcasts like The Journey Home, lines of questioning that I was thinking of in my mind and trying to find the answer to as I listened to these different episodes. There was a lot of things, and once I figured out, and once I finally said, "Hey, yeah, I'm a three," life eternally start looking different because I then was like, okay, I am doing this because I want attention. I am doing this because it gains me that admonishment, that admiration that I am desiring. How can I flip that into a healthy stance? And so it's been that outlook now. It's like, okay, it's okay to want this. It's okay to want to be admired. It's okay to want to be loved by the things that you achieved and to say, hey, you've done a great job. I really like this. Hear that from somebody. It's okay. And because prior, it was like there was a lot of shame attached to that. Hearing somebody say that you did a great job, or like they like seeing me on stage at church. There was a lot of shame, and a lot of times it was like, you shouldn't be seeing me, but you should be seeing the reason behind why I'm doing that. And in the worship atmosphere, it was, you should be seeing Jesus and not me. So there was a lot of like shame tied to that. But once I made that switch to like, hey, I'm a three, even going back and looking at the times people said, hey, I like seeing you up there. I'm like, of course you do. I'm good at what I do. I've been on the stage my entire life. I love being on the stage, type of thing. But even further down the rabbit hole, and I won't go even deeper into my story, but even going further down the rabbit hole as I'm thinking in my head, I realized a lot of that shame that I was feeling for wanting attention, for wanting admiration, was tied to religious shame. Uh, so there's that is. I could talk all day about that, but the story is too vast. The story is too deep. There's a lot of different tracks I can go down in my life, but I hope that illustrates overall what that looks like, what that journey looked like, going from that eight, with that counselor being like the person who initiated the thought process, and then life circumstances really forcing me to actually be intentional, to think out, okay, maybe I mistyped myself, and maybe I've been saying I'm an eight, but really I'm a three. Um, but then really being keyed into like, okay, here's my behaviors right now in stress. And that was the thing. That was the biggest thing right there too. As I looked at every stress point for different Enneagram types. I looked at where does eights go in stress, which is five. I looked at where do ones go in stress, where do twos go in stress, where do three. I went through all nine types and I looked and said, hey, where do they go in stress and what matches what is happening now? Because in this moment of life, I'm in the biggest moment of stress that I've ever felt in 24 years of living. And the only one that rang true was three. And so that's how I pretty much came to conclusion, was looking at that stress point. Where do threes go in stress, which was nines, and really just shutting down, really. That was really the final ingredient in all of it, because seeing that and not really resonating with any other stress points was it for me. But yeah, and so say all that to say, I've discovered my journey, and that's a little bit about my thought processes, with everything that happened to get me from eight to three into getting this new map of like I said, this new map to get to the destination of a better version of myself. But as I close out my story, I want to kind of put out these couple like tags to it. One, if you really want to figure out if you may have mistyped yourself, you've got to be intentional about it. And intentional is one of my favorite words, because it says, hey, I can't just let it happen by happenstance. You got to seek out the answers. Of course, some answers will come to you naturally. Some answers will come to you just through the flow of life. But if you feel like you've mistyped yourself, you've got to be intentional about seeking out, hey, maybe I'm a different Enneagram type than what I said. But then I also want to put that caveat to this. We envelop all nine of the types, but our primary type is what we focus on. So like me, I envelop 1 through 9, but 3 is really that brings out really where I come from, because, and here's the story, I was always admired by my good grades in school, by my me being one of the top readers in the school. That was like that key story that really brought it home for me. That part home for me. So try to find that story that's like, hey, this is where it all happened. For me, it was being admired for good grades, being one of the best student in class, being one of the top readers in the school. That stuff gave me admiration, and so that was my key moment to figuring out my type again. But you gotta be intentional about looking back at those stories, looking back at those memories. But then you also gotta allow yourself to be okay with the fact that you got it wrong. As a 3, I know the shame that can come along with that. Oh, I'm wrong. But even just as a human, we all carry the shame of, oh, I got this wrong. why did I get it wrong. It's okay to get things wrong. I mean, that's part of the life journey. Um, I was telling the students, I was for the class I was in a day on Friday. Sometimes life, we get things wrong in life. You just gotta be okay with it. It's okay to get things wrong. It's okay for life to turn out different than expected. Uh, so yeah, you gotta be intentional about finding out, did you mistype yourself? You gotta be, you gotta tell yourself it's okay that you got it wrong. Don't beat yourself up about it. But then you gotta be like, where do I go from here? For me, it was reframing the shame, and which is something that I'm still working on, because shame is the core emotion of the heart triad. Um, you, you gotta, what was I saying? I kind of went off on a different track. Um, you gotta reframe where it is you want to go from there. For me, is where do I want to go business wise? Where do I want to go fan base wise? What do I want people who admire me, who follow my brand, do I want those people to feel like fans to me, or do I want them to feel like a community, or do I want them to just feel like customers? You got to reframe some things for yourself. That's just an example of something that I've been reframing. Um, but yeah, you got to be intentional about finding out. You got to not beat yourself up about the fact that you got it wrong. Then you got to start reframing it. Again, as I say all the time, the Enneagram is not the final destination, but it is a map to help you get to the destination. Where are the cars? Where are the people driving the cars? And the Enneagram is that map. If we follow it, it can help us get, depending on how well we follow it. Now, here's another story, because me and my knowledge, I oftentimes will be like, hey, especially in Springfield, because there's parts of Springfield that I've been to a lot, and so I know them like the back of my hand. There's parts of Springfield that I've been to little, and so sometimes I still need to use a GPS to figure out my way around there. But then there's parts of Springfield that's in the middle. Like, I've been there a lot, but there's this one place in that section that I've never been to, so I need to use the GPS to figure out where to get there. But I'm like, I've been there a lot, and so I'm like, I can get myself there. But then I end up taking too many wrong turns, and I'm like, all right, I gotta put the GPS on. Depending on how well we follow the map, then there's the outline of how quick we get to our destination. I don't want to put the word quick in there, because life is a journey. I refer to life as a journey all the time. I really love the journey mode. Could be because I also like ships and sailing and pirates, and not really pirate ships, but like the old type of ships, the wooden ships where it really took months to get across the sea. Whereas nowadays ships, you get across the sea in no time. But I'm talking about, I really find interest in those like wooden ships. The power, the force behind the ship was in the wind and the sails. It wasn't, you didn't have it wasn't pretty much a motor. There was no motors, what I'm trying to say. And so, yeah, we get there, we figure it out, we allow ourselves to be okay with it, and then we just go, we continue on. It's okay that you got it wrong. We all get something wrong. But yeah, that like I said, I could go so much deeper, but that's the broad strokes of that story, of my story of going from 8 to 3 and uncovering this new map. And this is a short episode, then episodes happen, but that's okay. Like I said, we're And if we were at the plot of the story, we're starting our descent down to the resolution. And so, with that being said, that is all that I've got to say for this episode of Enneagram Story Podcast. Thank you again for listening. I appreciate every single person who supports this podcast by pressing play. Usually, I would give a whole spiel about ways you can continue to support, but since the life of the podcast is in limbo, I'm going to skip that. If you know what those ways are, you can do that. But if this is the first one you've listened to and you want to know how you can support this podcast more, you can either go back to a previous episode or you can DM me on Instagram at Enneagram Restored Podcast, saying, hey, how can I support your podcast? And I will gladly answer you back. But since the life of this show is in limbo right now, I am going to skip that entire long spiel. I'm just going to say thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast on Instagram, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And until next week, I want you to remember that the Enneagram does not define you, but it does bring restoration. It helps reshape your thinking and habits.